Welcome back to the Sounds of the Baskerville. I'm James Flaherty, here with Chris Baskerville, the star of the show, the Hound. How are you, Chris?
Good morning, James.
Welcome back to Patrick Schweizer from ALARES. Sorry, there was a mouthful, but we got there in the end. Hey, before we go on, what does ALARES mean, Patrick?
So ALARES is an acronym
Yeah.
which stands for Adverse Legal Action Risk Alert System.
Right.
And it's one of these things where I'm sure in time to come we'll all forget what it ever stood for, but it does actually have a...
I keep saying he was the Greek god of information or something.
Oh, yeah, that sounds like, yeah.
Well, the Greek god of the internet.
That's a much better answer than mine.
The
so-
Greek god of information.
And so one of the things, so thanks for coming on. We really had, last time we spoke, we were really talking about like, well, what's in the box? You know, what am I getting? And we had some really interesting stuff about the workers' comp claims and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of info that you've really tapped a way to be able to provide people in a useful way. So who again uses your product?
Yeah, so we've got a
Service.
number of key user groups.
Yeah.
So sort of half of our business, if you will, is credit providers. So that might be lenders, financiers, also trade credit providers. So say you're a supplier to the food industry or you're a supplier to the building industry, you provide products and services on trade terms. And then the other half is professional services. So this is lawyers, auditors, insolvency practitioners, anybody who is a part of their daily work needs to do due diligence checks and reports on either counterparties or new jobs you've been appointed to or whatever it may be.
So kind of, is that a case like in your case, Chris? Is it like show me the dirt on this guy, or is it a watch list thing, or is it both? Like tell me what they've got going now and what's coming. Is that?
Yeah, so
Yes,
somebody like Chris
Yeah.
would generally, as a part of sort of the day one process, there's a number of checks that an insolvency practitioner needs to do when they open a new file. As a part of that process, they can run our search, which gives them insight into any current legal issues as well as any prior legal issues that might help identify insolvency dates, might help sort of put the pieces together in terms of how did we end up here.
So hey, we talked about this last episode. So how did you? So is it really day one? Is it that the most important time for you to hook into ALARES, or is it during the process?
Probably the most important time is to get Patrick's monthly report, so you look like a champion on LinkedIn. That'd be the most important time to tap into ALARES, because that makes us look like we know what our numbers are and become a thought leader. But one is definitely the investigation side. So usually the hot zone of investigation is the 6-month mark before our appointment and then going back to 2 years. That's really the hot zone. So we're looking for what the company was involved in those years. So that's always important. But you can also use it as a precursor, which is preamble. If we're going to go into, say, a trading voluntary administration, probably the highest risk element that an administrator will go into, you kind of want to know, what am I going to land? What's going to happen on my arrival, and who am I fighting?
One of the things we always talk about in this show is who would be mad enough to take on a job where you take the personal risk of the business that you're about to administrate of. Chris Baskerville. So clearly anything that can provide him with as much armour, the better, isn't it? Like it's a great tool. So, but taking a step back, hang on, you've been doing this for a few years. You're kind of all seeing. You must have quite a cool bunch of data that because you talked about that. Like there's the monthly run statistics, like what your batting average is, but you've got a whole pile of stuff that you can see.
Yeah, absolutely. So we compile data now, obviously from the law courts, but also from ASIC, insolvencies, the ATO. Various other data points as well. And while the core of our business is providing reports and alerts to our users, within our data, there's a lot of really fascinating insights that come out of that. So each month we publish our credit risk insights, which basically looks sort of sifts through all our data and just looks for what are the interesting sort of stories that this information is ultimately telling us, both in terms of where we are today, but also looking ahead to see what may be to come.
So before we perhaps tap the great man's mind a bit, how do you use it? Like I said, you've talked with me before about the things that when you're talking to accountants, how are you using the ALARES?
Yeah, well, most recently, it's always been handy when you're doing presentations, typically to your accounting friends, because when you take ALARES data and you show them the effects of the pandemic during and after, most accountants are actually quite blown away, because they go, but hang on, a pandemic comes in, shuts the entire world down, businesses are all in lockdown, humans are in lockdown, and then when we say our work drops 50% for a couple of years, they don't understand it. They go, but hang on, the administration just said that the country is in a recession. How is it that you guys are now 50% more quieter than when you were pre-pandemic?
So
I don't get it.
Look at the graph then. Your job as an insolvency practitioner kind of halved overnight, effectively.
Yeah, new work through the door. Yeah.
So you go into insolvency when you can't pay your bills. What happened during the pandemic is you basically got a free hall pass to not pay your bills.
Yeah.
So you no longer had to pay the ATO. You no longer had to pay your lender. There was leniency across the board, because nobody had issue with paying their bills because they didn't need to. Naturally, there were far fewer who ultimately went into insolvency during that time.
I haven't talked about the fact that I work with liquidators and sort of people, if I'm at a social function and so forth, and people kind of edge away from you and start walking off to talk to someone more interesting. There
Like
wasn't,
an accountant.
Yeah, there wasn't that sort of the world's smallest violin that liquidators had nothing to do, but there is a job that is so important about getting, putting capital into the right hands, putting businesses that are competing unfairly by not paying their tax or their GST, sort of weeding out the.
We heard from a lot of our clients that there was quite some. Sure, if I'd go as far as to say anger, but there was certainly discontent that they had with the ATO for allowing businesses to string things along for as long as they did, where they effectively said, look, this company is for all intents and purposes no longer solvent. It should actually be shut down. And by the ATO not acting upon that, they're really just allowing this company to rack up more and more and more debt that these suppliers are then, unfortunately going to have to wear when the ATO does ultimately come back around to do what they should have done a long time ago.
So then so then when did you start noticing that, what was the things that you started seeing that?
Yeah, what was really interesting for us, and if you look at our graphs that we publish, you'll see a very prolonged period of the ATO effectively doing very little in terms of recovering unpaid tax debt. If you look at the similar graph for the big four banks, you'll see that they sort of dropped off at the same time, and they also, started doing, and rightfully so, being very lenient in terms of recovering their debts. But the banks actually switched back on a lot earlier in the piece, about a year or so, even 18 months earlier, where we saw then, okay, the holiday, if you will, is over in terms of paying your lenders, but we saw that the ATO just sat on the sideline, for longer and longer and longer, and then it became quite sort of apparent that at some point the rooster, this will come home to roost, and when it does, things may sort of go a little bit crazy for a little while. While this catch-up happens.
And looking at the ALARES chart, with the winding up applications, non-ATO versus ATO winding up, it's really not until sort of mid-2023 that they're really starting to come in at a prolific rate, and obviously increasing in 2024. But between 2020 and the beginnings of 2023 almost non-existent.
So Chris and I are famous for miscalling the tsunami, miscalling the zombie apocalypse. But I think, in a sense, did you see that the ATO was sort of saying that they were ramping up slowly? Is it sort of started to go? Is it a faster and faster tempo that you see, or what are you looking at? Is it kind of a question without notice? But what do you think that?
Yeah. So what we saw initially was that there were a couple of sort of blips where they had started to do something, and then they kind of slowed down again, and then they started again and kind of tailed off again. In more recent times, they've really been sort of full throttle, foot down, and they're going quite hard from all the things that we see and hear, and not just in terms of winding ups and court recoveries, but DPNs.
So director's penalty notices, right.
Garnishing notices.
Yeah. And are those, what are they? Can you see a DPN on your system, or you can at least get a sense of how granular can you get?
We can't see a DPN within our system, but we can certainly see any time the ATO is taking a company or an individual
acting on a DPN.
Correct.
Okay, and one of the other elements the ATO was using is that if you weren't engaging with the ATO and you had a debt in excess of $100,000 and it's been 90 days overdue, my understanding is that was going into a credit file. So Correct. Are you starting to see any of that information?
Yeah, so we get all that information now as well. So as you said, any arrears over 100,000, more than 90 days overdue, effectively without a repayment plan in place, will now get reported to ourselves as well as other reporting agencies. Gotcha. That data is also quite interesting, just in terms of the sheer number of businesses on that list. So it currently sits at around 27,000 businesses, and what we see
So just to be clear, that's 27,000 businesses that have been reported to a credit bureau because of this non-payment,
because they're not talking to the. Wow. These are the ones who are not talking to the ATO.
These are the ones who do not have a repayment plan in place. So they
could be talking, but they're not. They don't have a plan.
Yeah. So look, the ATO, the wording they use is meaningful engagement. Now, I think the practical reality of that means you've got to have a repayment plan. Yeah, gotcha. But certainly, if you are talking to them and making sort of suggestions that you're open to doing that, there'll be some leniency there. But if you're ignoring the ATO altogether, then you will end up.
And you're on.
And we've often talked about that. Like, don't ignore the taxman because he probably knows most of the stuff that you think you might be hiding from him. So it's always a good idea to be talking to them. So you can certainly see a real tempo. It's we've heard statistics, GFC type. What are we back numbers wise? Because you and I also have spoken. It wasn't exactly massively busy insolvency wise prior to COVID, but is it now? What are the numbers like in both your worlds? Are you seeing? I mean, you're flat out now, aren't you?
Yeah, it certainly feels like where those few years after GFC, it took a while for it to start biting in, and then it was just battle stations. It feels like the profession is getting to that level now. Certainly, my colleagues in Melbourne and Sydney are saying they felt like this 1 year ago. So it's almost like Queensland is just starting to catch those two major capitals.
What we heard sort of in the early days of the insolvency ramp up, and the numbers that we see, the numbers are sort of more or less 50% higher than they were in the
pre-pandemic
COVID days. What we heard initially was that there were a lot of businesses that may have had a legacy ATO tax debt. They potentially hadn't been trading for some time anymore, but they still existed as a legal entity, and effectively the ATO was coming along and sort of mopping those up. Whereas in more recent times, we hear that the jobs are more actual...
Something of substance and or just either still potentially trading or are about to shut the doors.
So is that a little bit more like it kind of used to be, where there's some stuff inside, there's actually some things to do as opposed to a dead entity, a zombie or a...
Yeah, I think there's always going to be there will always be shellless companies that end up in liquidation, and you knock on the door, can't find the director, can't find records, can't find anybody. But I think what's happening is, because there are a lot of advantages in voluntarily coming forward and voluntarily facing the music, and there's a little bit of leniency there in doing it, more directors, it feels like, are starting to show. So where they would ordinarily just bury their head in the sand, hopefully their accountants are getting the message. Just get on the front foot, because you've got options. And that's the only message we try and get out there, is to say you've got options.
I think, I think that's where the DPNs have really had an effect where, as a director, you're actually personally liable. It's not as simple as just torching your company, $500, go online, register a new company, and off you go. You're actually personally liable for the debts, the PAYG, the BAS and so on, unpaid super that your prior businesses incurred.
Yeah, so it's really, there are consequences for having your head in the sand. And as we've often said, Chris, we just want people to talk to you early. Don't wait till it's too late. Hey, that's been really. Can we get you back in for one more? I just want to have a bit of a chat about this whole SBR thing, because I think that's kind of where this goes. So we'll get you to come back in again. Thanks, Patrick, again for joining us on the Sounds of the Baskerville.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, Chris. Good to see you.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.